Hi, I'm Dr. David Dobson. Welcome to Conversations. Today, my guest is Dr. Rebecca Killick. Rebecca is a professor of statistics at Lancaster University. Rebecca's research interests include time series analysis. Today, we will discuss their research paper, A Recent Surge in Global Warming is Not Detectable Yet, published in Communications, Earth and Environmental Journal. It's a pleasure to have you on my show, Rebecca.
Yeah, thank you very much, David. Thank you for the invitation.
Rebecca, in your paper, you applied time series model to analyze global surface temperature data sets. Can you explain what time series is?
Yeah, so time series is basically any data that is observed over an ordering. So you can have things like sequentially observed over time, whether that's like every time you visit the GP, you've
Okay.
got a date stamp with
Oh,
the time that you visit, or
okay.
you can have things like sequences across a genome. So you have an ordering from the beginning of the genome to the end of the genome.
Okay.
Or when we're doing like clinical trials and things, you can have
Okay.
like doses. So you can go from small doses to large doses. So
Okay.
it's just a kind of statistical term
Okay.
for ordered
Okay.
data. So data that has a
Okay.
specific ordering to it.
Okay. So why people study time series? Like, what is the importance of time series data?
So I think one of the really cool things with time series data is that
Yeah.
there is that kind of sense of ordering to it. So if you
Okay.
imagine like one of the standard things that affects our
Yeah.
daily lives is kind of like, what's the weather going to be like tomorrow?
Okay.
Okay. And so if you're thinking about that kind of question, you kind of think, okay, well, what the weather's like today might have
Okay.
some kind of influence on what it's like tomorrow. So if we're, for example, in the summer, you might have, a really warm period. And so the temperature today is probably going to be able to inform what the temperature is tomorrow.
Okay.
And so equally, if you're in the winter period,
Yeah.
you're not going to expect to have really large temperatures like you might do in the summer. I'm
Okay.
thinking obviously Northern Hemisphere here. Um, and
Yeah.
so from that perspective,
Yeah.
you're kind of where you are in time
Okay.
affects what you might see. And so what time
Okay.
series analysis does is it
Yeah.
acknowledges that kind of dependence over time,
Okay.
dependence on where you are in
Yeah.
time,
Yeah.
and allows you to do a lot more prediction and be
Okay.
able to kind of use what you know from the past
Yeah.
to inform what you think might happen in the future. And
Yeah.
that's really interesting.
Okay. So basically, we can use this time series to prepare for the future and plan accordingly.
Exactly, exactly. And you can also use it kind of to understand what's going on now. And so that's kind of
Okay.
what we did in this paper as well.
Okay. Yeah. So I want to get back to paper. Before we got into paper, tell us why you were interested in studying the global mean surface warming rate from a statistical perspective.
So I think this kind of brings us back to the question of, well, why should we study this in the first place?
Okay.
And so there's a lot of kind of debate around climate change and
Yeah.
warming and things like
Yeah.
that generally in the world. And I think regardless of where you sit on that, I
Yeah.
think we'll acknowledge that the climate that we have
Hmm.
now is very
Hmm.
different from the climate in the
Yeah.
distant past.
Yeah.
Okay, the world, what it looks like now, is
Yeah.
very different from the past.
Okay.
What's the key thing going forward for
Yeah.
us
Yeah.
as a human race
Yeah.
is how is it going to change in the near future such that we can actually plan, and how is it going to change that affects our daily lives? So, for
Okay.
example, if sea levels are going to rise, that affects
Hmm.
coastal communities and
Yeah.
things like that.
Yeah.
You've also got like where we grow crops and things. We need to
Yeah.
be able to mobilize as a global
Hmm.
entity,
Yeah.
where our food production is, where people are living, how we kind of look after the global community.
Hmm.
And so, regardless of where you sit on what has
Hmm.
caused the climate to change,
Yeah. Yeah.
the debate whether there's human aspects involved or not, I'm not going to get into
Okay.
that.
Yeah.
Regardless of the fact is that the climate is changing, and that
Yeah.
will affect all of us. And
Yes.
so, we need to be able to plan for that in the future from a
Hmm.
government perspective, global perspective, if the
Yeah.
human race is going to thrive.
Yeah.
So what we're looking at in this paper is we're
Hmm.
kind of saying, okay, well, if we're answering that question of what's our climate going to look like going forwards, we need to kind of look at what trajectory we're on.
mm,
So if you think about that from a temperature perspective, that's only one element of our
yeah,
climate. There's obviously a
yes,
huge amount around
yeah,
other aspects of climate. But if we're looking
mm,
at temperature,
mm-hmm,
then as we kind of look forward in time, we
mm,
looked at the global surface temperature data
mm,
sets.
mm,
And the reason why we wanted to look at that statistically speaking is
yeah,
because there's been a little bit of debate in scientific community that's kind of
yeah,
spilling over into
yeah,
public discourse,
yeah,
which is around has the rate of warming increased?
yeah,
So we all know
yeah,
we've had
yeah,
record temperatures the last few
yes,
years,
yeah,
but if we're in a warming climate, we
yeah,
should be seeing record temperatures because
mm,
you've got a
mm,
trend like this
yeah,
as you move forwards in time.
yeah,
Your next observation is going
yeah,
to be higher, so
yeah,
we should be seeing record temperatures. The
yeah,
question is,
mm,
are they consistent with the rate of warming that we have seen already? And so
mm,
that's kind
mm.
of the statistical methods that we were using to answer that sort of question.
I just want to ask you a something different question. Temperature is always been like, synonymous to the global warming, climate change. So why temperature is a key variable to study climate change, or why people
That's a
focus so
good.
much into temperature?
So I'm not an environmental scientist, but I
Okay.
can certainly tell you from my perspective as a statistician.
Yeah.
So the temperature kind of affects a lot of things. So if you
Mm.
think about it naively, the
Yeah.
temperature is affecting, the ice melting,
Yeah.
in polar regions.
Yeah.
It affects the high temperatures that we might see around
Mm.
the equator
Mm.
and generally the
Yeah.
climate. A lot
Yeah.
of things around food production and
Yeah.
animal health
Okay.
is related to temperature. It's not just
Right.
temperature,
Yeah.
but that is a key element that we're kind
Mm.
of looking at. That's kind of why we're
Yeah.
looking around.
Yeah.
Temperature is a first instance. By
Yeah.
all means, it's not the only indication of
Yes.
things that might relate to our changing climate.
Hmm.
Um, but it is one that I think is certainly an important driver.
Yeah. Yeah. So I want to talk about your study. In your study, you use data from 1850 to 2023. Can you share about your data? Like, I know you have this pre-1970 data, and then you have this post-1970 data. So maybe you can kind of dissect the choice of your data period and why you chose these periods.
Yep. So there's many different kind of products of data that are out there.
Yeah.
People may be surprised to know there isn't just like one temperature,
Okay.
one global temperature. So
Okay.
if you think about it, you
Mm,
have stations that
mm,
are all over the world that are
mm.
measuring the temperature at those individual
Okay.
locations.
Yeah.
And you could look at that data
Mm,
individually.
mm.
What we try to do to kind of get a sense of what's going on globally
Yeah.
is we combine all of that information into a single value. Okay.
Mm.
That's what we call the global temperature,
Okay.
global mean temperature series.
Okay. So,
And so the data that we looked at was annual data.
mm,
So, we're
okay.
kind of averaging over the year.
Okay.
And there's different ways that you can combine all of those different
Mm.
stations as well
Yeah.
as the measurements in the ocean.
Okay.
And so we looked at five different data products, so five
Okay.
different ways of doing that combination.
Mm.
And they cover kind of the most commonly used ones in the field. Obviously, each
Okay.
one is going to differ slightly.
Yeah.
Um, we looked at all of them because we
Mm.
wanted to kind of be a bit more comprehensive and be able to be a
Yeah.
bit stronger in our conclusions.
Yeah.
So we looked at all of those. We looked at all of the record for all of those. So they go back to, as you said, to 1850.
Mm.
And those early measurements, there's a lot of kind of more variability there because whilst the data product owners have really tried to get rid of the effects of, back in 1850, there were no
Mm.
satellites. A lot
Yeah.
of the observations,
Mm.
especially of the ocean, were
Mm.
done from land.
Mm.
Occasional ones from ships and things
Mm. Mm.
that were kind of traveling specific routes.
Mm.
But there's a lot more data variability there. So we went
Okay.
right the way back to 1850,
Mm.
just because, that data does exist and we wanted
Mm.
to kind of include that.
Yeah.
Um, and then what we did was we did an analysis on the whole data set,
Mm.
to kind of show what the effect would be, if
Mm.
we look at everything. And then there's generally within the environmental science community, there's an agreement that there has been a change around 1970.
Mm.
And so that's the reason
Okay.
so in when we looked at all of the data, we
Mm.
also found the change at 1970.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but when we were doing our more in-depth analysis about the recent years, we did look from 1970 onwards,
Okay.
just because a lot of people in the community don't like the first part of the data, and
Okay.
so we kind of did it with both. So we did
Okay.
both the whole data from 1850 all the way
Mm.
up to 2023, and then
Mm.
also from 1970 onwards to kind of again, it's one of those things where we're trying to robustify our conclusions to be able to
Okay.
say, well,
Mm.
there's debate in the community about how we
Mm.
use the data and what
Mm.
data we use. So we
Mm.
basically did everything
Mm.
so that we were trying to say, look,
Yeah.
it doesn't matter
Yeah.
what you do,
Yeah.
this
Mm.
still isn't here.
Yeah.
So yeah, so
Yeah.
that's why we kind of looked at 1970 onwards.
Yeah. So, Rebecca, what did you learn from your study?
Yeah. So what we were actually looking for, which is quite interesting, is we were looking for a change in the rate of warming. So
Mm.
we didn't specify that it was an increase or a
Mm.
decrease or the type of change.
Mm.
We looked at lots of different statistical ways of deciding if that change has occurred, including things. So I mentioned earlier when I was talking about time series, we're talking about, well, how much do you depend on the past? Okay,
Mm.
how much does what I'm observing now depend on the past? And so
Mm.
there's different ways that you can incorporate that into your analysis, your
Mm.
statistical analysis.
Mm.
And so we were looking at changes. It's one of my areas of research is change
Yeah.
point analysis.
Yeah.
And so we looked at different ways to be able to incorporate that,
Mm.
whether that's allowed to change over time or not,
Mm.
how the trend is allowed to change. Does it have
Mm.
to join? So
Mm.
we're basically looking for a hinge like this,
Yeah.
or can it be disjointed where you might have a jump up or down
Yeah.
at the change? So we were looking at all of those different options for our modeling
Mm.
and seeing has there been a change after 1970?
Okay.
And so in the literature, there's some debate. Some
Mm.
people were saying that there looks to have been a change around,
Mm.
2010,
Mm.
2012,
Mm.
the early 2010s.
Mm.
And so we weren't specifically looking in that region.
Mm.
We were allowing the data to speak for itself,
Mm.
and say, is there a change after
Mm.
1970 or not?
Mm.
And what we found was that the only way that you can find a change after 1970 is if you make some incorrect assumptions. So if you say that what
Oh.
we're observing now
Mm. Mm.
doesn't depend on the past at all,
Mm.
then you will find a change around that period of 2010,
Mm.
2012.
Mm.
But one of the crucial things that you have to do whenever you fit models in statistics is
Mm.
check your assumptions.
Yeah.
And so if you check that assumption to say that now doesn't depend on the past,
Mm.
then you find that you were wrong. Okay,
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
that's in statistics, that's called a residual analysis.
Mm.
And so you find that there is dependence on the past. And so that
Mm.
tells you that you have to take account of that dependence somehow,
Mm.
otherwise you can get the wrong answer,
Yeah.
as we kind of did in this instance. So what we
Yeah.
found was that when you actually
Yeah.
satisfy those assumptions, you
Mm.
take that dependence, you say now
Mm.
does depend on the past,
Mm.
then we don't find any change in the warming rate. And so
Yeah.
the crucial thing there, I think, that
Mm.
is kind of a bit hard to determine is
Mm.
if you're saying that now depends on the past, that
Mm.
means that if you're saying it's a positive dependence, so it's like
Mm.
I'm going to follow a similar
Mm.
value than I did last time. So
Mm.
the temperature that's kind of
Mm.
today's temperature is going to be similar to yesterday's temperature.
Mm.
Then what you find is that if you have a high temperature yesterday, you're
Mm.
more likely to have a high temperature today. Okay.
Right. Yeah.
But the challenge with that is that if you're saying that, okay,
Mm.
my temperature today doesn't depend on yesterday,
Mm.
then that means that I could have any type of value within a
Mm.
plausible range today.
Mm. Mm.
And so if you take into account that today's value is
Mm.
dependent on yesterday's value,
Mm.
or in our analysis that we did here,
Mm.
2023 is
Mm.
dependent on 2022,
Mm.
you can then start to think, well, if I had a high value in 2022, I'm more likely to have a high value in 2023.
Mm.
It's not guaranteed, but I'm more
Mm.
likely to. And
Right.
so if you think about that, you can have runs where you have some high years. You can also have
Yeah.
runs where you have some low years.
Yeah.
Um, And so that is what we were kind of taking into account.
Right. Right. So what are the implications of this study?
Yeah. So in general, this basically means that we're not saying that there hasn't been an increase. What
Mm.
we're saying is that it's not enough to say statistically speaking
Yeah.
that there definitely has been an increase yet.
Yeah.
So it could be that if we get a couple more years data,
Mm.
that
Mm.
would actually allow us to be able to statistically say, yes, there was
Mm.
something controlled. And the reason why we're kind of being a bit more hesitant here is because of that autocorrelation. So
Yeah.
you have to have more persistence in that
Mm.
increase to be able to
Mm.
say statistically
Mm.
speaking change.
Yeah.
So if we look back in kind of
Mm.
2017,
Mm.
around then people were
Mm.
saying that there's been a something called a hiatus. So that means where there's been
Okay.
a slowdown in the warming.
Oh.
And so there was a lot of debate in the literature around
Mm.
that.
Mm.
And myself and my co-author, Claudie Bolio,
Mm.
we also produced a paper at that point to
Mm.
say, actually, there hasn't been a slowdown
Mm.
because we were in a period of low
Mm.
values, and now
Yeah.
we're just in a period of high values. And
Right.
so it may be that there has been a change, but we
Mm.
haven't got enough evidence for it yet. So
Mm.
we
Mm.
shouldn't we should be cautiously worried, but at the
Mm.
same time, it could just be part of the normal pattern. Now, the normal pattern is worrying enough, so I think I
Mm.
think I think that's something we should be looking at. What we did show in the paper, though, is
Yeah.
we actually provided those details for going
Mm.
all the way up until 2040. So
Mm.
a researcher that
Mm.
wants to kind of look at
Mm.
this data set
Mm.
again in the future
Yeah.
can look at our results and say, okay, when we have 2024
Mm.
measurements completed, or
Mm.
2025, or even
Mm.
2035,
Mm.
have a look at the table that's in the paper,
Mm.
and that
Mm.
will tell you a kind of a lower bound. So
Mm.
if
Mm.
your increase in the rate of warming hasn't
Mm.
exceeded that, it's
Mm.
definitely not statistically significant. Okay.
Mm.
If it has exceeded that value that's in the
Mm.
paper, we've
Mm.
obviously had to make some assumptions about how the
Mm.
future develops.
Mm.
And so it may be statistically, of interest.
Mm.
But essentially, you shouldn't bother looking at it if it's below that bound because we've been conservative.
Right. So, Rebecca, what is your advice to researchers who wish to continue research on this topic?
So this topic is really exciting, not only from the statistical perspective, because
Yeah.
there's
Yeah.
lots of new models and that need
Yeah.
developing and new
Yeah.
techniques, but
Yeah.
also from the kind of impact that you can have
Mm.
on the
Mm.
current debate and
Mm.
policy changes and things.
Mm.
So I definitely think get stuck
Mm.
in. Um,
Mm.
the data can be quite overwhelming at first,
Yeah.
especially if there's so many different data sets that you can look at.
Mm.
And the first thing you need to do is kind of say, okay, I'm just going to look at this one, and
Mm.
then before you kind of say make any wild big conclusions,
Mm.
you need to be looking at other data sets as well to kind of
Mm.
see what
Right.
question am I actually answering.
Yeah.
Um, but from my perspective as a statistician, one
Mm.
of the key things that you need is you need to be talking to the environmental scientists who actually
Mm.
understand the science behind all
Mm.
of. And so I was
Mm.
really privileged to work with Claudie
Yeah.
on that endeavor because
Yeah.
she knows all of the kind of science
Mm.
behind the kind of the questions that you might want to ask and what data sets might be useful to answer specific questions.
Yeah.
And then, we work well together as a
Yeah.
team in terms
Yeah.
of discussing, what actually is the question that you want to ask in layman's terms.
Mm.
So which might be, how is our climate changing? And then how you can drill that down into a specific question that you can answer with a specific data set.
Mm.
So different data sets, you can answer different questions.
Mm.
And you can pull different data sets together as well to answer bigger questions.
Mm.
And it's very complicated, but I think if you have an
Yeah.
environmental scientist who
Yeah.
is willing to kind of discuss and
Yeah.
have patience with the
Mm.
statisticians who don't
Mm.
understand the science behind it,
Mm.
I think that's really, really valuable.
Yeah. What is next for you, Rebecca?
Well, at the moment, actually, I'm currently on a visiting position at
Mm.
University of California, Santa Cruz. So for
Mm,
me at the moment, I'm doing some wonderful research here amongst the lovely redwood trees of California. Um, and so I'm here for a period of time doing research locally. This is where my collaborators Claudie and also Robert Lund are based. And it also allows me to travel to my other collaborators. So on this paper, it
mm,
was Yuheng Shi, who's at
mm,
University of Nebraska, allows me to
mm.
more easily get there, and
Yeah,
also to Colin Gallagher in Clemson University. I was just visiting him in last week, actually. So we're doing some really exciting stuff, working with different dependence structures and how we can actually advance our time series
yeah,
knowledge.
yeah.
Creating some cool graphics, actually. So
Nice.
visualizing
Yeah,
4D
yeah,
parameter spaces of
yeah,
auto models, which
yeah,
is pretty
yeah,
cool.
yeah. Um, how do you see artificial intelligence supporting or with your time series analysis? Do you see some collaboration down the road or some more models
Yeah,
developing?
certainly. Within the kind of AI literature at the moment, there's a big push
Hmm.
in this, to incorporate more time dependence
Okay.
into artificial intelligence models. I
Yeah.
think the crucial step in the learning process because obviously, as you're doing sequential
Yeah.
decision making,
Yeah.
you have to have dependence on the past all the way through.
Yeah.
So there's cool kind of recurrent neural network stuff that's been done already, but I think there's
Yeah.
a lot of scope here for different time series methods within AI kind of modeling. Um,
Hmm.
I like to think, AI modeling is as kind of a combination of statistical models and
Hmm.
automated decision making. That's kind
Yeah.
of my
Yeah.
way to think of it. That
Yeah.
the online learning perspective, you're
Hmm.
learning as data comes streaming in, and you'll make
Yeah.
automate your decisions as part of that.
Yeah.
So yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, I think huge, huge stuff going on there.
Thank you for your time, Rebecca, and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks very much for having me on, David.